Hello, my friends. A strategic assessment of Russia's position, NATO's rhetoric, and the approaching endgame in Ukraine. Recent speeches delivered by the Russian president to the Ministry of Defense, together with the extensive remarks of the defense minister, provide a remarkably clear window into Moscow's strategic mindset at this stage of the Ukraine conflict. Much of the Western media has focused narrowly on tone, rhetoric, or isolated phrases, but that approach misses the deeper and more consequential message embedded in these statements. What emerges instead is a coherent, disciplined, strategic posture rooted in consistency, long-term preparation, and a refusal to deviate from what Russia defines as the root causes of the conflict. From the Russian perspective, these root causes are not negotiable. They are not rhetorical devices, nor are they opening positions designed to be bargained away later. They constitute the minimum framework within which any settlement could occur. Russia continues to signal that it is prepared to negotiate with the United States as a sovereign actor, but it has little interest in negotiating with the current leadership class in Europe, whom Moscow increasingly views as incapable of independent decision-making, strategically unserious, and rhetorically reckless. The implication is unmistakable. Russia believes meaningful dialogue with Europe is impossible under present conditions and may only become conceivable after a political generational change on the continent. This is not bluster. It is a conclusion drawn from years of accumulated experience. Russian officials observe European leaders speaking openly about war with Russia in timelines ranging from 2027 to 2030, while simultaneously failing to demonstrate any credible capacity to prepare for such a conflict. Moscow hears the rhetoric, notes the dates, and responds not with slogans, but with planning. The most revealing aspect of the defense minister's speech was not what it said about Ukraine, but how little Ukraine featured in it. The bulk of the address focused instead on structural military reform, reorganizing command systems, improving military education, refining conscription mechanisms, accelerating weapons development, integrating new technologies, and creating new formations. This was not a speech about aspiration or intent. It was a checklist of implementation. Crucially, Russia made clear that it does not intend to dramatically increase military spending beyond current levels. Instead, it plans to maximize efficiency, discipline, and technological integration. This stands in sharp contrast to European discussions, which remain dominated by vague pledges, budgetary arguments, and political signaling. Europe talks, Russia builds. The result of this asymmetry is predictable. Western rhetoric, intended to intimidate or pressure Moscow, is instead producing the opposite effect. It is accelerating a Russian military buildup that is tangible, operational, and already underway. This buildup is not hypothetical, and it is steadily tilting the balance of power further in Russia's favor. On Ukraine itself, Russian messaging has grown increasingly confident. For the first time, the Russian president openly spoke of Ukraine approaching a point of collapse politically, militarily, and economically. This assessment aligns with observable realities. Russia is advancing on the ground, dominating the airspace, and sustaining an economy capable of supporting long-term operations. Ukraine, by contrast, is facing a deep fiscal crisis, manpower shortages, and a deteriorating ability to replenish its forces. The war of attrition, which Western planners dismissed or misunderstood, is working precisely as Moscow intended. Russian officials now openly state that Ukrainian losses have reached levels that fundamentally undermine Kyiv's capacity to continue the conflict. Whether exact figures are debated is almost beside the point. The strategic trend is unmistakable. Russia believes victory is no longer theoretical, but imminent. This belief, whether ultimately correct or not, has profound implications. Leaders who believe they are close to victory do not compromise. They consolidate. This confidence is not directed only inward. It is also a message aimed squarely at Washington, particularly at any American administration that believes Russia might be maneuvered into accepting cosmetic compromises dressed up as peace proposals. Moscow has made it clear that it is not interested in Istanbul Plus, freeze plans, or security guarantees, that replicate NATO membership under another name. These are non-starters. The repeated cycles of Western proposals illustrate a deeper dysfunction. Each iteration claims to move toward realism, yet each ultimately circles back to the same framework: security guarantees for Ukraine, continued Western military presence, and the preservation of NATO's strategic reach. From Moscow's perspective, this is not negotiation. It is repetition masquerading as diplomacy. European talk of war in 2030 appears, at first glance, implausible. Europe lacks the industrial base, political cohesion, and public support necessary for large-scale rearmament. European populations are neither willing nor able to bear the economic and social costs such a project would require. In this sense, much of the rhetoric likely serves other purposes: sustaining military-industrial funding streams, maintaining American engagement, and creating a narrative of existential threat to justify political decisions. Yet rhetoric has consequences. When repeated often enough, it can escape its original function and begin shaping reality. The danger is not that Europe is deliberately planning war with Russia, but that it may drift into escalation through its own inability to control its language, assumptions, and expectations. This risk is amplified by intelligence and security statements that openly reference covert operations, sabotage, and dirty war tactics. Such signals reinforce Russian perceptions that the West is already engaged in hostile activity below the threshold of open conflict. Russia's response to this environment has been to emphasize deterrence. References to strategic systems such as Poseidon, Burevestnik, and other advanced platforms are not casual. They are reminders that Russia retains the capacity to strike not only forward bases in Europe, but the United States itself. These systems exist to ensure that no Western planner can plausibly imagine a controlled escalation that excludes catastrophic consequences. The message is simple and brutal. Any attempt to turn Ukraine into a forward operating base for NATO forces is unacceptable and will be treated as an existential threat. Moscow has been explicit that the deployment of European troops to Ukraine under any label or pretext is a deal breaker. It sees such moves not as peacekeeping, but as preparation for future war. German, British, and French statements about troop deployments resonate deeply in Russia's historical memory. They are interpreted not in isolation, but in the context of previous European invasions and conflicts fought on the same terrain. Anger and alarm are natural responses under such conditions, and they reinforce Moscow's conclusion that Europe's current leadership is not a viable negotiating partner. On the American side, Russia's patience is clearly eroding. Moscow increasingly doubts Washington's ability or willingness to deliver on promises. Each round of talks produces assurances, followed by proposals that revert to maximalist Western positions. From the Russian perspective, this pattern undermines trust and strengthens the influence of voices in Moscow that argue the United States is not a mediator, but an adversary operating through proxies. What emerges from this entire picture is not chaos, but grim clarity. Russia believes it is winning the war in Ukraine. It believes time is on its side. It believes Western unity is brittle, European resolve is performative, and American diplomacy is incoherent. Under such conditions, compromise is not merely unnecessary, it is irrational. The tragedy is that this outcome was avoidable. A decisive American disengagement early on could have frozen the conflict and forced a recalibration. Instead, prolonged half measures have produced a grinding war whose endgame now appears increasingly one-sided. The longer this continues, the narrower the space for diplomacy becomes. The speeches from Moscow were not emotional outbursts or theatrical performances. They were statements of record. They outlined priorities, assumptions, and red lines with unusual frankness. Those who choose not to listen are not misunderstanding Russia, they are ignoring it. And history suggests that ignoring such signals rarely ends well. As the conflict approaches its decisive phase, the fundamental question is no longer whether Russia will compromise, but whether the West will finally confront the reality it has spent years denying. The answer to that question will shape not only the end of the war in Ukraine, but the future security architecture of Europe itself. As this conflict moves toward its final phase, The most dangerous mistake the West continues to make is not underestimating Russian capabilities, but misunderstanding Russian intent. Moscow is no longer acting like a power-seeking validation, compromise, or reassurance from its adversaries. It is acting like a state that has accepted the cost of confrontation, absorbed the shock of sanctions, adapted its military doctrine in real time, and emerged with a clearer sense of its own resilience than it possessed before the war began. That psychological transition matters more than any single battlefield gain. Wars are not decided solely by territory captured or weapons deployed, but by which side concludes correctly or not that history has begun to bend in its direction. From the Russian point of view, the West has revealed its strategic emptiness. NATO talks endlessly about future wars it cannot realistically fight. European leaders speak of sacrifice while governing societies that are unwilling to endure it. American diplomacy oscillates between promises and reversals, signaling not strength but confusion. Against this backdrop, Russia sees no incentive to rush, no reason to bargain away leverage, and no obligation to rescue Western leaders from the consequences of their own rhetoric. Every new proposal that repackages NATO expansion under another name only confirms Moscow's belief that the conflict was never about Ukraine's sovereignty, but about power, alignment, and control. What makes the situation especially grim is that the space for de-escalation is shrinking not because Russia refuses to negotiate, but because the West refuses to accept limits. Moscow has stated its red lines repeatedly and with increasing bluntness. Ignoring those lines does not weaken them, it hardens them. Each month that passes reinforces the Russian conviction that victory, however defined, is achievable without concessions. Each escalation framed as deterrence convinces Russian planners that restraint is a luxury they can no longer afford. In this sense, the war in Ukraine has already reshaped the global order, regardless of how or when the fighting formally ends. It has exposed the gap between Western narratives and Western capacity. It has demonstrated that economic warfare is not a substitute for strategy, and it has reminded the world that great powers, when pushed into corners they deem existential, do not retreat, they adapt, endure, and press forward until the threat is neutralized. The tragedy is not that diplomacy failed, but that it was never seriously attempted on terms that acknowledged reality. Peace was postponed again and again in favor of slogans, timelines, and moral performances that could not survive contact with material facts. Now, as Russia consolidates its position and prepares for a post-Ukraine security environment, the question facing the West is no longer how to win, but how to live with the consequences of having misread the moment so profoundly. History is unforgiving to those who confuse intention with power and noise with momentum. The end of this war will not be marked by a dramatic announcement or a triumphant press conference. It will arrive quietly, almost anticlimactically, when one side recognizes that the outcome has already been decided. And when that moment comes, it will be remembered not as the failure of courage, but as the failure of judgment, a failure rooted in the refusal to see the world as it is, rather than as one wishes it to be. What has become unmistakable over the last several years, especially since the start of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, is that the West's old playbook is losing traction. The United States and its European allies still speak as if they're the unchallenged authors of world order, as if sanctions are a magic spell, as if media narratives can still hypnotize entire continents, and as if international isolation is something Washington can simply declare into existence. But the Ukraine war has acted like a stress test that exposes how much of that power was always dependent on fear, compliance, and the assumption that there was no alternative. The West assumed Russia could be economically strangled, politically quarantined, and militarily outlasted. They assumed that flooding Ukraine with weapons, intelligence, and financing while marketing the war as a simple morality tale would produce a strategic victory that could be replicated elsewhere, and they assumed that Russia would remain alone, or at least that potential partners would be too cautious to openly deepen ties. That's the framework the West was working from. But the real-world results point in a different direction. The West's coercive tools are eroding, and the war itself accelerated the formation of counter-systems, economic, political, informational, that reduce Western leverage. Start with the most basic strategic point. Ukraine has been a proxy battlefield in a broader confrontation between NATO and Russia. The details of weapons shipments and slogans can't hide the structural reality. NATO states trained Ukrainian forces, coordinated intelligence, provided targeting support, and treated the conflict as the proving ground for exhausting Russia. That wasn't a humanitarian project, it was a geopolitical one. And once you recognize that, you also recognize why the war's outcome matters far beyond the Donbass or the Black Sea coast. It's not just about borders. It's about whether Western hegemony can still enforce limits on other major powers. This is where China's posture becomes crucial. Early in the conflict, Beijing was cautious, careful with language, careful with exposure, careful not to present itself as openly aligned against the West. That restraint wasn't affection for Washington, it was risk management. China's leaders understood the costs of confrontation inside a global economy still heavily shaped by Western institutions, Western finance, Western choke points. But as the war progressed, the lesson became clearer. If Russia can be isolated, sanctioned, and bled for refusing Western demands, then China is not watching a distant European dispute. China is watching a rehearsal. If Russia were to fail strategically in Ukraine, the implications wouldn't stop at Russia's borders. NATO expansion pressure would intensify. The Western model use economic warfare, information dominance, and proxy militaries to break a target would be validated. And China, which Western elites identify as the long-term systemic rival, would move from being the next target in theory to being the next target in practice. So the war in Ukraine didn't merely push Russia closer to China, it pushed China closer to the conclusion that Western pressure is not a negotiable nuisance, but a structural threat. That's why you see less hesitation now. That's why you see a firmer emphasis on multipolarity, on alternative trade channels, on building financial infrastructure that can't be shut down by Washington's signature. And that brings us to the sanctions regime, the West's favorite weapon, and the one it uses so casually it sometimes forgets. Sanctions are not laws of physics. Sanctions only work when the sanctioning coalition is large enough, unified enough, and economically dominant enough to make compliance the least painful option. The moment the targeted states can trade, finance, and ensure outside Western control, sanctions become an inconvenience, not a cage. The shift from 2015 to the Ukraine era illustrates this transformation. In 2015, the West could still count on major powers to cooperate, maybe reluctantly, maybe with modifications, but still cooperate. Russia and China were not yet in a direct and total confrontation with the West. Their exposure to Western finance and markets was a vulnerability, and they behaved accordingly. It was costly to openly defy Washington's sanctions machinery. After the Ukraine war escalated and Russia itself became the primary target of Western economic warfare, that old calculus collapsed. Russia no longer has an incentive to treat Western sanctions as legitimate. China, facing trade war pressure and strategic containment, has far less reason to pretend Western economic discipline is the natural order of things. Once the West weaponizes everything, banking rails, reserve currencies, technology, supply chains, it teaches the rest of the world that integration means hostage. I would did it. So the West's sanctions obsession has produced the opposite of what it claims to want. Instead of forcing submission, it has encouraged major states to build escape routes. And here's the thing that Western policymakers consistently underestimate. Building an alternative system doesn't require perfection. It only requires functionality. If you can move energy, goods, and payments without asking permission from Washington or Brussels, you've already reduced the West's leverage. If you can create trade corridors, parallel financial arrangements, and political blocs that coordinate against coercion, you don't need to defeat the West in a single dramatic moment. You can outlast the West's ability to dictate terms. This is why institutions and coalitions in the global majority matter more now than they did a decade ago. The West used to treat such formations as symbolic photo ops, declarations, talk. But under the pressure of sanctions and proxy wars, these networks become practical. Over time, Practical alternatives harden into strategic realities. The informational dimension matters too. For decades, Western media enjoyed near monopoly authority over international narratives, especially in places where Western outlets and Western-framed local media were dominant. Russia was demonized with a kind of lazy confidence. The West didn't even have to argue well. It could simply repeat. It could lean on repetition and assumption. But the Ukraine conflict forced more people inside and outside the West to watch Western narratives collide with observable reality. When the West insists it is merely defending democracy while it pours weapons into a proxy war, people notice. When the West declares itself anti-imperial, while it openly treats entire regions as zones of influence and resource control, people notice. When Western leaders speak of human rights while backing policies that devastate civilian populations through economic warfare, people notice. And once people learn to see how narrative manufacturing works in one theater, they become harder to manipulate in the next. That's one of the most important second-order effects of the Ukraine war. It didn't just reshape alliances, it educated audiences. This is also where the West's internal contradictions become part of the strategic picture. Western governments cannot sustain a permanent global crusade without suppressing dissent at home. The more the public senses that they're being dragged into conflicts, censored for questioning policy, or pressured to adopt a pre-approved moral script, the more the legitimacy of the entire project degrades. That's not a moral lecture. It's a stability problem. Empires don't just collapse because of external enemies. They collapse because internal consent erodes and the cost of coercion rises. And the West is now dealing with the limits of its own power in ways it is not psychologically prepared to admit. It still speaks in the language of dominance, but it increasingly acts like a system that has to improvise, shifting rationales, changing talking points, rotating villains, recycling old claims because it can't produce clean victories. The Ukraine war was marketed as the war that would cripple Russia. Instead, it exposed Western dependency, Western industrial limitations, and the fragility of a sanctions-centered strategy in a world that is no longer unipolar. The broader direction is clear. The world is in transition, not in a tidy way, not in a way that guarantees justice or peace. Transitions are messy, but the vector is away from a single center of control. For Russia, that transition means the West's capacity to isolate and dominate is weakening, and that cooperation with non-Western powers is becoming less risky and more normal. For China, it means the need to prepare for intensified pressure is not theoretical, it is an immediate strategic requirement. For everyone watching, Ukraine becomes the case study. How the West operates, how it uses narratives, how it weaponizes finance, how it leverages proxies, and what happens when those tools meet real resistance. If you want a single sentence summary, it's this. The Ukraine war didn't merely change the map of a battlefield, it accelerated the collapse of the West's ability to enforce a single story and a single system. And that, more than any single frontline movement, is what terrifies Western strategists. Because once the spell is broken, once countries stop treating Western approval as the price of existence, the age of easy coercion ends. The West can still cause enormous damage. It can still disrupt, but disruption is not the same as control. The future, for better or worse, belongs to those who can build durable alternatives. Trade routes that can't be shut down, financial mechanisms that can't be frozen, political partnerships that can't be blackmailed, and information ecosystems that can't be monopolized. That is the real strategic lesson running beneath the headlines of the Russia-Ukraine war. And the bitter irony is that the West, by overusing its weapons of pressure, has trained the world to manufacture antidotes. In the end, the significance of Ukraine is not confined to trenches, missile strikes, or shifting front lines. Its real importance lies in what it has revealed about the architecture of the old order and about how fragile that architecture actually is once it is forced into the open. For decades, Western power rested on two pillars that reinforced each other seamlessly: material dominance and narrative dominance. Material dominance meant control over finance, trade routes, energy markets, technology, and military logistics, the ability to open doors for allies and slam them shut for adversaries. Narrative dominance meant the power to define reality itself. Who was the aggressor? who was defending international law, which wars were humanitarian, and which sanctions were moral necessities. As long as these two pillars stood together, resistance was costly and alternatives seemed unrealistic. Ukraine shattered that illusion not overnight, not dramatically, but relentlessly. Reality, when it persists long enough, has a corrosive effect on slogans. Predictions of Russia's imminent collapse failed to materialize. Isolation turned out to be selective and reversible. Sanctions, rather than breaking Russia, accelerated the construction of parallel systems. The war dragged on, and with each passing month, the gap between Western rhetoric and observable outcomes widened. What once sounded authoritative began to sound rehearsed. What once felt inevitable began to feel improvised. And that is the moment when fear starts to dissolve. The most important shift triggered by this war is psychological. States across the global south and increasingly within the West itself began asking questions they had long suppressed. What happens if we are next? What happens if our reserves are frozen, our payment systems cut off, our access to markets weaponized? What happens if political independence automatically triggers economic punishment? And most critically, do we have alternatives? Those questions are not academic. They are existential. And once they are asked seriously, the logic of dependency collapses. This is why the emerging multipolar order does not announce itself with a single declaration or treaty. It advances quietly through infrastructure rather than ideology. Alternative trade corridors, non-Western payment mechanisms, energy partnerships outside dollar control, defense cooperation that does not depend on NATO approval, and political alignments based less on shared values than on shared vulnerability to Western coercion. None of these systems need to be perfect. They only need to function well enough to reduce exposure. And every reduction in exposure is a reduction in Western leverage. What Western policymakers still struggle to grasp is that power based primarily on punishment has a shelf life. You can terrorize markets. You can disrupt supply chains. You can destabilize governments. But once enough actors conclude that compliance offers no long-term security, punishment loses its disciplining effect. It becomes noise, dangerous noise, but no longer decisive. This is where the West now finds itself, still capable of enormous damage, but increasingly unable to enforce obedience. That is not strength. It is a late-stage condition of dominance. And history shows that systems in this phase tend to oscillate between escalation and narrative reinvention, more sanctions, more threats, more moral language, while their actual control continues to erode. Ukraine also accelerated something the West can neither sanction nor bomb: learning. Once countries see how narratives are manufactured, how humanitarian language is weaponized, how rules are applied selectively, they do not unsee it. Once audiences watch the same playbook deployed repeatedly against Russia, against Iran, against Venezuela, against anyone who resists, they begin to recognize the structure beneath the story. And when narrative authority collapses, material authority soon follows. Perhaps the deepest irony is this: by overusing its instruments of pressure, the West has trained the rest of the world to build immunity. Financial warfare taught states to diversify reserves. Sanctions taught them to trade outside Western systems. Information warfare taught populations to distrust official messaging. Proxy wars taught governments that neutrality is not protection. Every coercive act became a lesson. Ukraine, therefore, is not merely a battlefield. It is a mirror. It reflects the limits of Western power back at those who assumed those limits did not exist. It reveals that the rules-based order was never neutral. It was conditional, enforced, and reversible. And once that realization spreads, the world does not return to obedience. It adapts. What frightens Western strategists is not a Russian advance or a Chinese policy paper. It is the slow disappearance of the West's ability to define reality for everyone else. When the remote control stops working, when people stop accepting the script, the system becomes unstable, no matter how many aircraft carriers remain afloat. The future will not be orderly. Multipolarity is noisy, uneven, and often uncomfortable. but it is also irreversible once momentum builds. The age of effortless coercion